Mal, you can help kick us off.
Yeah, I'm going to. On that note, there are 147 people here who are so excited to learn about grant writing and grant funding. And I was saying before, for those of you who are just jumping on, this is really, really actually a truly special experience, other than getting to see parent-child banter, which I'm totally here for, by the way, but also because we have two generations of grant writers and funders sitting together that are going to allow us to talk about what really are some of the tried and true practices for you to be thinking about in your grant writing, and what are funders thinking about or always thinking about, but also particularly right now when it comes to building relationships with organizations. And so we're going to sort of straddle that line and talk about both what you do, but also how you show up, and what it looks like to really build connection. So I have a number of questions for everyone as we go through things. I've switched the order up just a tad so folks know, but I'm not throwing in any big wild cards. But before we get into that, before we start to talk about this, I want to just say a few other quick housekeeping things. We know that the chat is off. We've decided to not throw another little tech wild card in there, and we're just going to leave it off. If you have anything that you want to make sure we answer at the end of this, or that maybe I try to even incorporate into the conversation we're having, please drop it in the Q&A. I'll be watching that as we go along. But before we dive into the topic, Zach, do you just want to take a moment and introduce our panelists, let folks know sort of who's here, who they're learning from, and then we can get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, we could see. I might have just figured out someone could test the chat there if we could use it now. Or maybe just type in where you're from or where you're calling in from on this side. We'll see if it works. I think I might have just opened. There it is.
Oh,
All right, we figured it out. One hurdle past Mallory there.
check. Green check mark.
Well, I'm excited, obviously, to be able to do this. Obviously, our company Cadenza is helping kind of sponsor this and put this on, but Mallory has been one of the first few people that I have been a not just tremendous fan of. You see me with my books here. Shout out Mallory Erickson and her What the Fundraising book and podcast that she is a part of, but she's someone that I've always really kind of respected and trusted to be able to help facilitate some of these conversations. And I think it's a great time to just give a very quick introduction of everyone as well, because I think it leads into the backstory of Cadenza and how we got built. It starting with my mother, Miss Jacqueline Hynek, who was obviously not just generous enough with her time today, but I think her generosity has been something that has just been a huge part of who she is, and something that I've always looked up to on our side, not just through the work that she's done through our family foundation, but this woman is everywhere from school boards to, PTA meetings to all these different kind of involvements that she had in our community. So as we were kind of starting off and building this platform that could be so great for, not just grant writers, but kind of the whole nonprofit fundraising community, it came from so many of the insights that we first learned from me getting to sit in on the board, a few of our board meetings through our family foundation. And I think as we started kind of telling some people what we were thinking about of building a platform that uses AI to help kind of reduce the stress and workload of fundraising, sure enough, Miss Cassandra was the first official, I think, client and partner that we had and brought on, because she has so much tremendous experience and starting her own writing consulting firm and Legacy Grant Solutions. So Cassie is a grant writing extraordinaire. And then after I think a month or so, she looped in her mom, Brenda Rozinsky, who is the grant and foundation officer at My Possibilities out in Dallas. So I'll let everyone kind of tell a little bit more about themselves, maybe once we go through a few questions and people can kind of lead off with a little intro. But that's how we got full circle today to be able to kind of help tell this story of not only some of those insights and best practices, but why we wanted to take this more real kind of personalized and human centric approach to kind of sharing these insights. So, Mallory, did I already talk too much? Mallory?
No,
Shaking your head.
not at all. I think everyone's background is so great. And thank you all for showing up in the chat right now. We love hearing from you and seeing just how many of you are here, where you're calling in from, or, do you call it that anymore, where you're zooming in from, but to be here with us today. And so thank you for giving that background. The other thing I want to say, we'll talk a little bit at the end for those of you who are looking for tools to help make your grant writing more efficient. If you're interested in hearing more about Cadenza, Zach told me before the call they're doing something super generous all for folks on the call. We'll talk about that more at the end. But I also want to say the reason Zach and I got connected thank you for saying those kind words about me, is that I was really inspired by the way that Cadenza is building a technology tool, but actually with a fundraiser focus, not a fundraising focus. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. It helps your fundraising, but it's for you. And I think there's actually a really big difference in tech development when you think about that. And the first time we talked, you were like, only talking about fundraiser burnout. And I was like, don't you run a tech company? I was like, who is this guy? And so I think it's like really important as we talk about everything that we're talking about today, that we're doing it through the lens of like, you all are going to be the folks implementing the strategies that we're talking about here. And we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that feels approachable and accessible and actionable to you. So I just wanted to add that sort of last layer. So Jackie, I'm going to start with you. You have been involved in grant making for over 20 years. And I know that a lot of people are coming to this call sort of wishing they could get inside the head of a funder right now. And so I'm curious, like, what's one piece of wisdom about this work that has remained true over time? Like, what's one thing you've noticed sitting in that seat for 20 years?
I would say the biggest maybe fallacy of funding is that it's easy to give away money. And it's not. It's really hard. If it was easy, there's lots and lots and lots of people that would be doing it that's not doing it today. And so the key for me, and I think most of our board members, is the relationships that funders can build with their organizations and their agencies is, to me, the first and foremost, most important thing, way more important than the grant application. For us, the grant application is secondary because we don't take unsolicited grant requests. We do take letters of inquiry, but most of our grants are through relationships that we have with current agencies that recommend other agencies to us, or people that we meet along the way. And after those discussions comes the grant application. So I would say the relationship is, to us, the most important piece to get grant applications and granting started and then continue.
Okay. So I really appreciate sort of kicking off with that relationship piece. And I'm curious, Brenda, as somebody who's been on the other side, on the grant application side for a number of years, there are a number of questions I could ask you, but I'm curious, when Cassie, your daughter, first told you that she wanted to start her own grant writing consulting business, what did you tell her was the most important thing you wanted her to know about how to be a successful grant writer? And I'm curious kind of the overlap there between that and what Jackie said about the actual grant writing piece perhaps being secondary to the relationship building side of things. Is there any connection there in terms of what you've seen on the other end?
Absolutely. It's interesting. When she first told me that she wanted to do this for a career, I was super excited because I love what I do, and to have Cassie want it to do it as well. It was just so exciting. The first thing I told her is just how rewarding of a job it is. I find that on a daily basis, not only do I get to interact with the participants in the programs that I'm writing grants for, but I get to meet those funders. So I get both sides of a beautiful world. So interacting with the participants, in my case, I'm serving adults with disabilities, but then to have those strong relationships with the funders, it just comes full circle, and that's what makes it work. I also wanted to tell Cassie when she started out not to sell herself short. So it's really hard when you start out as a grant writer because there's not a lot of experience besides just getting in there and writing the grant, right? But the thing you have to understand is you're doing more than just writing the grant. You're sharing with a foundation this nonprofit that they might not have heard about before. So you're sometimes the first introduction that they have to their mission. And so that's just really a great way to start that relationship and have those conversations early. I just really want to support her and any grant writer that wants to get started because it is all about the relationships.
I'm curious. Okay. I really appreciate that reflection. And I'm curious, Cassie. Actually, Brenda, I'm asking you one more question. I can't help myself. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, because you right now are managing around like $5 million in grant funding. And, Zach tells me you have almost a 60% win rate or something like that. And
Yeah.
I'm hearing what Jackie's saying about the relationships and what you're saying about the relationships. And I'm like, how does this woman have time for this with $5 million of grant funding? So can you just like tell me a little bit, like, how are you successful in that way? And then I promise I'll get to others too.
Okay. So first, my previous career was I was a manufacturing engineer. So process driven, and that's really what something I brought to the table, I think. And I try to share with other grant writers, but just to be process driven, I kind of work off an 18-month calendar. I've already had conversations with my returning funders to see if we're still in the game for this year and if anything's changed on their end. For my returning funders, I see a 99 to 100% return rate. Sometimes you see a little fall up if something's changed with the foundation, but for those longer term relationships that you can continue to steward, that return or that award rate remains very high. So I'm seeing, less 60% around that, or sometimes a little less for new funders. Those are often because you don't have that relationship and you're having to just get in front of them with an application. They might not accept conversations ahead of time, things like that. So I think for me, 60% seems low. I really have a goal of 100%. And that's where I start off. I really have that dream every time I submit a grant because I vetted it. I've either done my research, I've reached out to the funder, I've had conversations. If I haven't done that, at least I've done, Mallory, you did a talk recently about the 4 boxes. And I try as I kind of plan my grant strategy for the year to really look at the foundations that I can apply to, even if they're new, that are going to be the best return, right? So it's not going to be somebody that I'm applying to cold that maybe we're not a fit. If I apply, I feel like we're a fit. I just have to convince the funder that we're a fit. If it's not open to having conversation ahead of time. So that's why I think I have a good success rate, is because I really expect to win every one of them. I want to respect the funder's time as well. They receive a lot of applications, and I don't want to submit something, waste my time, but most importantly, to waste their time because they read a lot of applications. And if I can make sure that I'm aligned, I think that's best for everybody.
I love that. Like, you're being rigorous about your own time investment in doing those things, but you're also, without having that face-to-face meeting necessarily that Jackie mentioned, you're demonstrating your commitment to that relationship or your interest and your sort of like awareness of the funder's experience too, in not just throwing anything, spaghetti at the wall. To Jackie's point, like, it's hard to figure out how to award different, grants. And so in some ways, like, doing that alignment filter for everyone, probably even for the ones that you don't ultimately win, creates like a relationship in the fact that it was still so tailored, so specific, so intentional, which is just such a great, like, foot to put forward. So, okay, so I'm curious, Cassie, for you, you had a mom who was a grant writer, you were going into this, like Brenda shared, a few great sort of pieces of wisdom. What are some of the things you've really learned from how she does things that have been really critical to your practice and sort of particularly for the moment that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think really just after listening to her talk briefly, I think you can see one of the biggest things that I've learned from her is just to put like my heart and my passion into the work. That was the reason why I wanted to get into it in the first place. My younger sister has Down syndrome, and so we grew up, learning about the nonprofit world and seeing the benefits that so many of these programs had. And so it was always something that meant something to me. And so, when I got into it, I really started, I work with a variety of clients, but I always try to choose and partner with those that I do feel connected to their mission and what they're doing. I feel like that just makes me a better storyteller for them. So I think that's first and foremost the biggest thing that she's taught me is to truly see like the meaning behind the work. And to take the time to see the results and experience the wins rather than just like moving along to the next thing. She's very intentional, and I try to put that as part of my process as well. Obviously, if we're getting the grant, like take a moment and really celebrate that, but also if we're not, to not just like write it off, figure out why. Is it because we're not a fit? And if so, then okay, now we know, and that might just not be on the list for next year. But if we are, and if we just needed to go a different direction or have more steps in our process as we like approach that specific foundation, then that becomes, just notes and feedback that we can use for the next cycle to get us to that higher win rate. I think additionally, what I've taken, is just learning how to be like a full strategic partner. Um, you're so much more than just like a grant writer. There's so many pieces that go into it. And so, like, positioning myself to be relevant at every table, whether it's sitting in on all the program calls or, looking into the financials deeper. There's so much relevance for the writer to be a part of all these conversations. It helps us to bring those questions to the table that they might not have, been thinking of, but it also just like really gives us, again, the full story so we can paint that whole picture. So I think for me, she's just like motivated me to be like a one-stop shop for all my clients. So bringing that like passion to it, but also just being able to help them with whatever stage they're at. Some clients I work with, they have a lot of returning funders, and we're just like cultivating those relationships. And then there's others that we're really like starting from scratch. And so being able to position myself to help them really wherever they are.
Mm. Okay, Jackie, I want to go back to what you were saying before about the relationship first kind of mentality and the way that that's been such a big part of the Topfer Foundation. I would love to know if you have an example of an organization or an experience, where that organization did a really good job building trust with your foundation. There's so many fundraisers in the room, and they're trying to figure out at the very beginning stages, I think, not just how do they build a relationship for their immediate specific need, although that is urgent, of course, and they feel a lot of urgency around that, but also like I think you've probably had 8-10 year relationships with some of your grantees. Like, what does the beginning of that relationship look like that happens in a way that really builds that trust?
So I'm going to tell you about two organizations, and because they're very different. One is an organization that services teen moms, and we have funded them for almost 22 years. And we changed our funding model probably about 10 years ago, where we're giving $1 million a year in pretty much 2 locations at the time. And in order to keep bringing in organizations, we had to, and sometimes make tough decisions to let organizations go. This one particular agency, every time we met with them, and at the end of the conversation, we were going to tell them this might be the last year, they tell us about a new program, a new way they're using old funds, and how they're consistently stretching themselves and repurposing themselves to do a little bit more. And we would walk out of those meetings saying, okay, I guess we're going to fund them again, because there was constant excitement and good work. So I would say that as long as an agency continues to push themselves to, one, stay true to their core, and two, to do more and maybe get rid of old programs, introduce new programs, and continue to grow. That's been key for us. The second one, and this is really specific to all the grant writers out there, we met with, through a friend, Ronald McDonald House wanted to build a new house on a local hospital campus. And so we took the meeting and we met with them, and we assumed that everybody's going to go on your website and see what your average grant size is and how often do you grant the same organization, et cetera, et cetera. At the time, our average grant size was somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. And we sat in the room and they did a whole song and dance and asked us for $1 million. And our first reaction was, oh my God, did they not do their homework? How could they ask us for $1 million when that is heads and tails more than the majority of our grants? And we stood in the parking lot, and after the first meeting, we said, instead of why not, why can't we? And so I would tell every funder or fundraiser out there, push yourselves to ask for what you need, even if it's sometimes much more than a funder typically gives, because you never know when a program, when an organization is going to present itself that sparks enough interest in the funder side for us to, instead of saying why we can't do it, push ourselves to say maybe we can do it.
Okay, Zach, just a fair warning that I'm coming to you next, as like being on the funder side and sort of seeing the experience of fundraisers, putting proposals or trying to win grants. And I think you're particularly like aware of and sensitive to the experience of what's happening inside those organizations, which inspired you to create Cadenza. But before we do that, there was a comment in the chat that I actually want to address around, Jackie was talking about excitement and innovation, and that their family foundation seems to really value that. And there was something that you said that really stuck with me, that it wasn't, they were staying core to who they were, but sometimes they were closing a program to try something new, right? And that they were innovating and iterating on the work that they were doing to try to do better at achieving their overall mission and their overall goal. And one of the things I just want to say is, one of the things that we know about foundations in general is they're not all the same. Some foundations, family foundations, private foundations, corporate, like to pilot new programs. Some foundations like to be stability funders. Some foundations like to do partnership launching, and so it's really important that we're getting the opportunity to go inside a funder's head right now and hear about how their particular foundation looks at this. But it's important for all of you, the fundraisers, that you're looking at funders to understand at which moment that funder likes to get engaged with an organization. And if they are more inclined to fund innovative new programs to try out something, or if they are the type of funder that wants to do sustainability funding around something that is demonstrating a certain amount of metrics, or they want to help it scale, right? Everybody has their own orientation. And so I just would encourage everybody to recognize that it's not one size fits all. And she's highlighting a very important thing to find out about the funder before you put an application in front of them or an LOI in front of them, or try to have a conversation when you're looking for a very different type of funding than what they focus on. I think it just highlights that there's a lot of diversity there, and this is why being able to put on that lens is really important. Okay, so Zach, talk to me about because I'm sure what some people are thinking, and we have seen this, sometimes in the funding space, that it can be hard to find those sustainability grants, that we are demonstrating growth or success, but the process of finding new funds for that sustainability can be really hard and really overwhelming. And so grant writers and organizations are constantly trying to figure out, okay, how do we find more funders? How do we apply to more funding? How do we, find the right funders for us? And so I'm curious, like from your lens, how has working with your family foundation led to the creation of Cadenza? Because I think it's through this lens that I'm sort of talking about here. And why? What do you see as some of the solutions to this rub that we're talking about?
Well, I think there's something that, even as my mom was speaking to, of having that understanding of, even within our board, there's a lot of different personalities, a lot of different kind of, focus areas, or are kind of giving pillars that mean something completely different to, depending on, even I've heard this before, of for some of these larger organizations, it could literally be depending on who just picked up your application in the pile at that point in time. So how can we help organizations, to Brenda's earlier point, do a lot of that, initial research, but also staying organized, and as opposed to our kind of traditional databases that are out there where you get these hundreds, if not thousands of, perhaps grant opportunities that you could be able to apply to. Where can we use some of these new AI tools to do some of that digging ahead of time? But I agree with what my mom was saying earlier about, I think the grant application isn't always the most important part. I think it's what often gets you in that foot in the door, or it kind of is really important in that follow-up piece to the process. But it's often the most time-consuming piece of that process, or it can take days, if not weeks, especially on the federal grant side, to be able to actually do all of the digging. And I think, Brenda, you were saying at one point that you're very specific about the grants that you look at, and you don't, Brenda, keep me honest here too, of are touching too many of these kind of, big government grant applications, because you just know how finicky they can be, or as we see right now, how unreliable that kind of funding source could be. And I thought it was something that always just dawned on me of if we could build tools and technologies that could help just reduce the amount of time of those more manual processes, then we could allow people to have that time back to, as I know something that Cassie had said to us earlier was, in some of our initial feedback conversations, was oh, I just don't feel like I'm so stretched thin, or caught up, and don't have the time to do that extra leg of research to find that alignment between our organizations, to where you could really have even something in your letter of inquiry that shows oh, you really did your homework, or you were able to find a way in with one of the organizations that we do support. Because I think those are all those little tidbits and nuggets that, oftentimes really do elevate the whole application, where it's okay, let's set up a call.
Okay, I have a unexpected question that came in through the Q&A, and anyone who wants to answer this can. One person asked, I think it's a really interesting question, how can you determine whether or not you have built a relationship with a funder? Maybe you've had that meeting, but what are some of the signs that there is really a genuine relationship there? Whether or not it's yes, apply to this thing yet, but sometimes the timing doesn't work, right? There isn't always sort of a call to action, immediate next step. What are some things you would consider to be signs that they would help them understand what they're experiencing on their end a little bit more?
I can go first, but Jackie's probably got a great response too. For me, I just try to reach out as much as I can and kind of share our program, whether they funded us or not. But for my returning funders, just throughout the year, I'm sending emails, I'm sending photos, I'm inviting them to events that are not necessarily fundraising events, but more, hey, keep in touch with us events. We just recently had one where it's like an Impact Partners breakfast, and we just invite them to breakfast and kind of share our highlights over the last year and what we plan for this year. And it's interesting how many people will come out to those, but it doesn't have to be coming to our facility for an event. Sometimes it's just, hey, are you able to hop on a quick call? I'd like to give you an update. If they're responsive to that, you start to feel, that you're developing that strong relationship. So those are just ways that I do it. It's just trying to keep connected with them throughout the year.
I would say that's 100% how you manage that relationship. When we started our foundation, we were giving close to 100 different agencies a year. And we have over time narrowed that because we decided, one of the founding principles of our foundation is every board member must be personally involved in every site visit, in every read of every application, every read of every grant report, because that's the only way. My dad, who started the foundation, was just his opinion, but he thought his opinion was always right. That's the only way you really can responsibly give money, is if you partner and understand the agency you're giving money to. So perhaps that makes us unique as a foundation, but even in the very first get to know you meeting, let me show and tell my agency, it's really hard not to walk out of a room for a good agency and say, yeah, we have to figure out how to give them money. And then we invite people to apply. And that's when we get the nitty gritty of the agency, all the fundamentals and the programs and the dollars and cents, which from my view, if the grant writers can spend their time completing the application thoroughly and thoughtfully, and if an AI tool like Cadenza can help them do that, they can then apply for many, many more grants, right? Instead of my application looks different than your application, then looks different than the next application. And you're spending more time filling out paperwork than you are looking for or selling your organization and looking for the right funds. Did I answer that did I answer your question?
I think both of you gave different ideas about how you take steps to build relationships, and then what the process might. Again, I don't think these are one size fits all. I think we're giving people a really unique kind of look under the hood in a certain sense about the process, but it also sounds like just a big piece of this is the sort of genuine connection and conversation. I think what's interesting about what you said about the, those details come later, is that sometimes I feel like I see organizations really try to lead with sort of too many operational details about how they fulfill on mission, as opposed to that relationship piece and I did this as a fundraiser. I remember applying and being like, our program is Monday through Friday from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. And nobody cared, right? That was not about the impact that the program had. Nobody cared about the logistics of my bus schedules. And, but I feel like because for me, the structure of the program was so unique, I was so proud of that. I sort of overemphasized these details that through the funder's lens, are not what you're saying, really build that relationship from the get-go. So I really appreciate that lens. We're getting a bunch of questions related to showing impact metrics. And I'm curious, one of the things that I had wanted to ask you, Cassie, was, we know that grant writing requires a ton of reporting. And so I'm curious, how you help funders to see the impact of their donations and demonstrate that impact build. And I'm going to stack questions, which you're not supposed to do as a coach, but I'm going to do it because on top of that, I'm curious, people are wondering in in the Q&A, how do you get that data from the program people? So like one, how do you show it to the funders? But then what does that internal process look like for collection of that in the first place?
Yeah, I would say for me it's been a unique journey just like working as a contract grant writer. So I'm working with a lot of different clients and I'm not, there in-house working with these people every single day. And so for me, getting all of that data early on is so important. That's part of my process when I first start working with a client, is to really just gain access to either where they're like storing and reporting that data. But again, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. I do think that the grant writers bring a different perspective that maybe the program coordinators weren't tracking certain things, or as we're creating different goals, we come in with that different perspective, whether it's for a specific narrative or we just know that this might most likely will be a future question, that they can start tracking all of that. I think looking at reporting specifically, it's been interesting for me. Like I said, I have some clients that do have really strong relationships. And so with that, that's something that, we are touching base with them. Kind of like what my mom was referencing is really all year round, we're trying to provide some sort of update to them. So you're not just only in their inbox when you're asking them for something. It's more so to give them those intentional updates. But taking that extra time to really update them on where their funding has been spent, I think is what I've seen the biggest impact with, and to give them the full story. This is where the program started, years ago. This is where we were. This is what you helped with. And because of that, these were the immediate outcomes, but also it's made us really think about long term, like what we're going to be able to do, for next year's program. And so to really paint that full picture for them, I think has been really helpful. But I think going back to, if it's a new funder, figuring out how we align and how it can turn into an actual relationship is where I'm trying to place a lot of that focus. And a lot of that can come from creating just those like non-required reports as well. A lot of the times, we're so focused on what's actually like on the calendar of what is to do. And I think, because even using Cadenza, like my time has freed up enough that I'm able to be a little bit more creative and figure out like, okay, when can we be really putting our foot forward for these like non-required touch points, to give them those success stories, those like brief impacts. When a program first wraps, can we send them something, a little less informal and, just get something in their inbox, I think has been super helpful. But I think it goes back to what Jackie said, a great application can get you funding, but the reports and the relationships is what keeps it coming back like year over year. And that's like the biggest win. That's like the goals to have a group of people that are in your team that that you can always reach out to.
It reminded me as you were speaking, Cassie, of a quote that I'm borrowing from one of our grant program officers, Kathy McCann, who, when we were going through an application, she said, and I remember that stood out with me, she was like, every time I read through this grant application, I'm just reminded of all of the good work that this organization does. And I feel like that's the general feeling that you want someone to have when you're having them review your reports and when you're having them kind of review your program impact metrics and your outcomes. But to be able to elevate that story, I think it was research that was done by LinkedIn Labs that was talking about one of the number one ways that they found that they were able to build or see their representatives build trust with their clients was to be able to educate them on a topic that they already are invested in and care about. And if you think about our donors, every single one of them cares about the mission that our organizations are a part of. So being able to have more of that kind of collaborative approach with your audience, Brenda, I was always impressed and curious how you think about kind of tying in some of those like educational pieces. Is now, shout out to Brenda, if you guys couldn't already tell, is amazing for so many ways. But I know, Brenda, they were even trying to like start to model your process or trying to think about how they could spin out my possibilities and more organizations beyond just Dallas, because you do such a good job with, I should say your team does such a great job with kind of running that. So how do you start to think about, like education in general? And
so I think one of the things, this is where I've kind of landed, where I'm at right now. So over 80% of what I write grants for right now are actual general operating funds. I'm not really writing a lot of project specific. I've switched over. My funders have really opened up to the idea post COVID. I think general operating has really started to land with a lot of funders. So that's where I'm headed with it. And what I try to do is my process for reporting outputs and outcomes and things like that is I do a once a year big data collection month, and this was it, January. And then I got some great data that I can share out and show the impact of our whole organization versus a specific project. I think that has really been beneficial for me and also for the funders. I think that they're liking to hear these bigger numbers that we're reporting and some of the overall impact. But I think two things happen a lot of times in what I'm seeing with foundation, especially family foundation applications, is they're starting to ask a lot more about sustainability and what's your plans for that. And, general operating funds is kind of how I lean into that. But also, they want to know what's next. Are you going to continue to grow? Are you going to serve more? What's the need in the community? And how you're aligning with that. And so those are the kind of things that I think gives you great opportunity to share what might be down the pike a little bit. But usually I don't go too far into what's next. I want to focus on the year ahead or the couple of years. Sometimes it's a multi-year grant, but I don't go too far in. I just kind of tease it out there a little bit until we're ready for it. And then when we're ready to ask for funding for that, then I've kind of led them along the journey a little bit that they know that this is coming, but I never put it full up in my applications until I know it's actually going to be a project we can do. I don't ever want to get funding for a project that we can't actually deliver on. So I focus more on general operating.
I love that. One of my favorite things to say is some money is very expensive to accept, and not making sure it's aligned with really your core goals and what you're trying to do. And I'm in no way suggesting that you create new programs in order to fit with foundations that want to fund new programs, right? This is why it's so critical to be grounded in who you are, what you're trying to do, what your mission and vision and orientation is, and then finding the funders that are really aligned with that. Just for everybody's awareness, the Q&A is blowing up like faster than my family text thread. So I'm going to do my best to answer as many of these as possible, but if I haven't gotten to it, please know I'm not intentionally ignoring you. I am just doing the best to filter by kind of the groups that we're seeing here. One thing that seems to come up a lot is, we've talked a lot about relationships, but there are a lot of organizations that don't have those relationships, particularly organizations that have been started in historically underserved communities, marginalized communities, where in their networks, they don't have a friend of a friend who sits on a foundation or even necessarily network connections in the sort of services world that they're in. And so there was a question about, how do you start? How do you get in front of folks if you don't have a way to get that kind of warm connection? And Zach, something you said a few minutes ago, I think is a great answer to that, even though you weren't answering that exactly, which is recognizing that all of the nonprofits, you have knowledge and insight and information and resources that are interesting to funders. And I think one of the things I see the least that can be the most impactful is, instead of just trying to get a meeting or, trying to sort of get your foot in the door to talk about funding, maybe you wrote a blog, maybe you have a panel coming up that's about educating your community on a certain issue area that your organization addresses. And all you're doing is reaching out to that foundation to say, hey, do you want to come to this? Or we thought you might find it really valuable to read this. Here's some research that we're doing in this area. We know you care a lot about blank, blank, blank. And we wanted to, keep you in the loop about what we're working on over here as you make your, and so I think, I think this like goes back to actually something, Brenda, you said at the very beginning in your advice to Cassie around kind of like knowing your value, right? And not underselling yourself. I think one of the pieces I see nonprofits often do is think that they don't have anything of value, and they're the ones who need money, and the funders are the ones with the money, and the only purpose of that relationship is to get some of that money, which then doesn't feel good to the funders and it doesn't feel good to the fundraisers. And so I would encourage folks to think about, to recognize the assets that you have inside your nonprofits
My
do.
time in there too,
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I meant to, but what you were saying, I think was so important, especially as there was a recent organization who invited us to go participate in one of their kind of program, like coffee chats that they had. They called it High Tea for their organizations. IC Star, shout out them, who is in Chicago, who does amazing work. And I thought it was just so cool to be kind of invited into that, but then to just like we show up at a lot of these different events, but I think it's important to be thinking a little bit outside the box, how to be able to talk about whether it's kind of blog posts, newsletters. But I wanted to put this back to my mom, Jackie, to be able to talk about when we started recently giving in South Florida, because I know that was a kind of new transition where we had to start. Why don't you talk a little bit about what that kind of experience was specifically for, as I'm thinking, Mom, our collaboration with like the Broward County Foundation, as we're also thinking about the relationships with other community members, as we started kind of asking those questions, and how also like our work with Flight Center, we were almost so impressed by like the collaboration that we saw within organizations who were supporting each other there. Because I think that's another misconception that people just don't often realize, like that you're not always competing with other organizations who are doing similar dollars. And that's actually pretty impressive to us when we
Right. I think, Mallory, you sent in one of your questions that you sent ahead of time. The difference between our work in Chicago versus our new work in South Florida. And I will tell you, to Zach's point, the collaboration and the non-for-profits in our focus areas in South Florida is amazing. And when we enter a new community, the very first thing we do is go meet with the community foundations, if they have one, to understand what agencies in the community are doing work that fit with our giving areas. And that's the first entrance. So we're making a lot of that first knock on the door, as opposed to the agency knocking on our door first, which back to the relationship side starts the relationship right from day one. The other thing I will tell you is in these underserved communities that you talk about, Mallory, ask the other agencies that are doing similar work who their funders are, because it's so helpful to say, dear so-and-so, Mallory Erickson told us about your agency and we'd like to share with you about ours, but anything to set you apart from just that unsolicited grant application. And that doesn't mean, this is what we found in Chicago for many, many years. If I tell you another good agency, they might get money that I'm currently getting. And so I get that, but that was a huge turnoff for us as a funder. We want to give money to the agencies that are doing the good work. And it doesn't mean because I give to you, that means somebody else is at risk for losing money or not getting money. And I'll tell you one other quick story about that. Zach was giving an agency in Denver. He started in Denver. Our program officer went with him. They met with the Denver Community Foundation. And I don't know if it was 1 or 2 years, they gave money to an agency, and then the agency, I think, went out of business. And Zach was pretty deflated. Oh my God, you know, we gave money to an agency, they're not there anymore. And was it a bad decision and bad use of funds? And truly the answer there is, if you helped one person, it was never a bad use of funds. What's the learning that you can take away from that? What did well, can we do better on our end to make sure they're not going to go out of business in year 2 after we funded them? But if you're helping one person, that's totally enough to know we did good work 1 year for one person. And Brenda, the other thing I just want to say, and then I'll be quiet, is we start with most agencies with program grants. And very quickly, as the relationship develops, it becomes general operating. You know, we know it's a good agency. They're using our funds well. So even before COVID, you can have the best program in the world, but if you don't have money to keep your lights on, you're not going to be able to deliver your program. So that was a big learning for us, probably 5 years in, stop being so focused on a program, because a program is easy. You can measure the success or failure of where your dollars went in a program, but overall operating grants, how do you measure that? But as we develop these relationships, maybe that's one of the things that's unique about us. We want them to keep their lights on, to be able to continue to deliver these great programs.
Yeah. You know, if I can finish with that, it's interesting. There's a switch that has to be flipped on the inside of the nonprofit as well if you go to operating grants, because all the time as a grant writer, you're just stopped in the hall by different program people saying, hey, can you get us money for this? Hey, could you raise money for this? And it changes. And so you have to then educate that staff, because instead you say, whatever you want for the next year, put it in your budget, and we'll try to raise general operating funds, and then you guys can spend it how you need to based on what your plan is, versus trying to come to me and get, I get it all the time where people used to come to me and say, we need a grant for this, and how long would it take? I'm like, oh, no, that's not going to work, because there's a time commitment that you have to make with the grant process. So I just found it was easier, but there was a lot of education I had to do on the program side to get them to understand, you don't come to me anymore with one-off grants. You put it in your budget on an annual basis, and that makes them start thinking ahead a little bit farther about what their needs are. Sure, there's emergencies that come up, but again, general operating funds can help fund those as well. Yeah.
Jackie, I'm so happy that you shared all of that, like particularly busting that myth around the competition side of things, and also that strategy of when you're entering a new location, going to community foundations and figuring out kind of the lay of the land and the landscape. And, one thing I'll say is that I had an experience where the community foundation actually wasn't funding my organization. We had been rejected from a grant, but another funder did exactly that when they were trying to do a particular type of work in the community. And that community foundation still recommended our work to that funder. And so I think, having different funding entities aware of what you're doing, building those relationships, offering opportunities for them to get engaged in your work. Okay, maybe you aren't getting this, quick return that you were hoping for, for whatever reason. I think Brenda's also telling you is not the way to think about it. I think it's it's really, really great. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I'm knowing the way that fundraisers and nonprofit leaders jump from thing to thing to thing. And Zach, a lot of people are messaging me about Cadenza. And you told me before the call, but in my ADHD brain, I cannot remember exactly what you said, that you have you're doing something special for folks right now, given everything that's going on in the grant space. So can you share what that is so that nobody who leaves right at the 30-minute mark will miss it?
And we'll follow up with the recording for everyone there too. But I think something that we're trying to do a better job of is, as you can see here, just make it easier for fundraisers to be able to find organizations that are a good fit. I think, as all of us now blatantly know, is that relying on a singular funding group is going to be potentially putting your organization at risk, especially with federal funds and the changes that we're seeing happening there. So for the month of February, perhaps kind of moving on further from that, but our grant finder tool that we offer, which is just another grant database with some more AI specific tool sets that are available. We're going to be giving away for free of charge for the next month for everyone who is able to sign up. So we can then, for our kind of fans of both Mallory as well as people on the webinar and get access to this recording, we'll also be offered a 7-day free trial of the full platform. Because I think the easiest thing they could do, whether you're trying to find new organizations to apply to, whether you're just trying to see where the balance is between AI and some of those kind of new tools that are out there, like Brenda and Cassie, I think are the best examples of this, but it's like, just get started and just, you will never know about whether or not you are a good fit unless you can write that letter of inquiry, unless you can actually apply to some of these organizations. And I'm always so impressed with people like Brenda, but I've heard this feedback too of like, every no you get is an opportunity to learn more. And you will never, I don't know, Mom, you confirm, have you ever been disheartened or annoyed by someone asking for feedback on maybe why they weren't a good fit or fund, or would you welcome that?
100%. And that no, and that follow-up call with why starts to build a relationship, right? Beyond a piece of paper. For us to say, wow, this guy got rejected, but they called me, we had a 30-minute conversation, and maybe we made a mistake in our no. Or maybe we're not the right funder, but we know another funder that would be, to your point, Mallory, you know, with the community, they told you no, but they recommended you to somebody else. So I'm not downplaying the importance of that application at all. Especially once you're an agency that is being funded by our organization, the subsequent years that grant application is probably much more important than that first year to tell us how you're using the funds and how you're expanding, et cetera. But that relationship piece is key to in every aspect to me.
You know, I met Zach in person for the first time in November, right? That was our first in person, I think.
Yeah.
He picked me up from the airport, by the way, which is just about the sweetest thing ever. And then I was
For the
speaking
book
at
tour. For the book tour.
For the
It's
book
so
tour.
good. Buy the book.
Okay,
Buy the book.
it's not about me.
It's so good.
Okay, so he picks me up and we're going to Patagonia in downtown Chicago, and we needed to pull over so that he could do a demo of Cadenza to a potential client. So I got to sit there next to this. And if you know me or you follow my work for a long time, you know I take my recommendations around technology extremely seriously in two ways. One, that the technology is going to be really good, and two, that as fundraisers, you're going to be taken really good care of. And I literally sat there next to him doing this demo with like my mouth agape, watching the way in which he was showing this organization how they could accelerate their grant writing process, the quality of the content that the tool helps you be able to produce and repurpose. I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat around AI, concerns around AI, or how does something like Cadenza differ from ChatGPT? I told Zach, one day you're going to take this marketing advice to do a side-by-side test of ChatGPT versus Cadenza, and he would show you very clearly the difference. But I think, you know, when it comes to letting AI into any part of your process, whether it's writing a grant or anything else, you need to be doing it with a provider that you trust, to be aligned with your incentives, to be aligned with your interests, to be aligned with your community. And so for me, like the orientation of Cadenza through your history of being a funder, through your empathy of the fundraiser, and then building something that like people can be proud of. And yes, there's a human element to all of it in the most important ways, but I'm so grateful for what you built, because I am no longer a grant writer, but holy moly, do I wish I had had this when I was the ED of an organization wearing every single fundraising hat and so exhausted typing those grant applications. Like this is the tool that would have changed my life. And so I'm just really grateful for what you built. And before people jump off, I wanted to make sure to say that, like, really from my heart, and for hosting this today and being continually invested in the experience of fundraisers, even in how you educate the sector. So I know we're going to stay on a little bit over to answer some additional questions, and I wonder if if I can actually kick that to you, Zach, we are seeing a lot of questions around, AI's role in grant writing. And, Jackie, you might have thoughts here too, or Brenda or Cassie around, where can AI play a role? Are there places people should be cautious of it? Like, talk us through how you think about that from an ethical lens.
One, Mallory, I adore you. And, I would go to the moon and back for you on that side. And again, guys, seriously, you should. You should. You see it behind her. She's got enough copies. So
I know, you don't need to hold
start
it
mailing them out
up.
today. I swear. She can start sending them out. But I've seen it so much more on the actual grant maker side is where I think these new like AI tools bubbling up. I think it was the what was it? The Patrick McGovern Foundation. Yes, the Patrick McGovern Foundation just released a Grant Guardian AI tool to help kind of evaluate all these applications. I could imagine like Mackenzie Scott or Mackenzie Bezos. Is it Mackenzie Scott Bezos? What is it, Mallory? Am I making it up now?
Mackenzie Scott.
I think it is just Mackenzie Scott Foundation.
They're divorced.
I blew it. So on her front, it's like they're getting all these kind of more, larger funders probably get hundreds of applications. So I think we're just seeing it happen more and more. But Cassie or Brenda, have you guys gotten any feedback of people being concerned? I feel like I don't really get too much of that on the funder side.
I'll just say I go to a lot of like networking events and things like that. And grant writers that have been around a while, like me, were a little hesitant to go down the AI road. And so there are some people that are concerned that their data is being shared and things like that. So you might address that with Cadenza, because I know that you've got an answer for that. But the other thing is I always try to encourage people, if they haven't used AI, just figure out what your pain points are. What are some of the things that are really causing you the most time, taking up the most time, or causing you the most frustration? And kind of dive into AI with that. And then the rest of it falls in place. You've also got, Cadenza has some great learning tools to get people on board, like P.
Yeah, I would say the only thing I wanted to mention just on that is, I don't know, I feel like there's can be misconceptions around it that it's taking over the role of the writer, or it's writing the grant, and it's like that's not. I'm sure there's some people that try to use it that way, and we're not pitching that at all. I think what it's helped me with so much is being able to like gather my thoughts, or it's pulling from grants that I've already written. And I think the thing that was the most annoying for me is like I would pull up a new application, and I would remember just like something great that I wrote and like could not for the life of me figure out like where is it, like what grant was it in. And so this helps, really just to like I can go into Cadenza and say like I'm working on this grant for this client. I know I want to talk about these 5 things. Like, help me just pull from everything that I've written in the past and get me the data and just kind of consolidate my thoughts. And so for me, it's just been like such a great starting point that I don't feel like I'm starting from scratch every single time. It's like having your own assistant. It's like just really streamlined my process. But then, also going back to it's freed up my time that now I can create things that weren't required. And so you're seeing the benefits of leaning into those relationships more because you are able to spend time doing those things. But I think for me, just having that freedom and that assistance, that it's like, okay, at the end of the day, I'm still going through and I'm writing all these applications, but it's at least getting me to the point that it's like this is all the work you've done before. So let me just like bring that top of mind to you so you're not like constantly searching for it. And it's opened it up that I can like work for more clients now, and that wasn't the case before. I've told that to Zach. I'm like, honestly, because I'm using Cadenza, like I'm working for more clients than I ever thought I could because I have the time to, and I'm way more organized.
With that in mind, I just have to say that I spent my whole professional career in human resources at Motorola. And I remember when we went, our factories transitioned from people on an assembly line to robotics doing that work, and that fear that technology was going to eliminate all these jobs. And what it did was allow us to repurpose jobs not eliminate them. And I see this AI as the same thing. You know, for older people like me, of course we're afraid of technology, but what we're also finding, I'm not that old, but what we're finding is that it allows you, people like Cassie, to repurpose her time, not take over her job. And that's the key, that if she can push a button and find the 10 best answers she gave in the 10 last grant applications she wrote, how much time will she free up to apply for 15 more grants, right? And I think that's the key. You're never going to eliminate the person or the human element. You're just going to rework it and allow them to use their time more efficiently.
Yeah, and I mean, just to sort of double click on that and what you said at the very beginning, Jackie, is like, this is about relationships, and relationships are human. And so, and what we all need more time to do is do the more human stuff, and to do it from a state where we're more relaxed and connected and open and collaborative, and all of the parts that we can optimize and make more efficient and make easier for us to do, so that we can, I mean, I remember when ChatGPT first started like sort of exploding, and I was hearing all this fear about replacing nonprofit jobs, and I was like, holy moly, like, aren't we all wearing 12 hats? Like, what if it just like took like 4 of the hats, 6 of the hats, you know? And so I think about it a lot in that way, which is like, there's so much of what was discussed on this webinar that actually isn't about AI. The purpose of the AI is to give you the time to do that. And so I think like that's just a really important, please take my hats, a really important piece of this. Okay, I need to get Jackie back to the beach in Mexico. That's like really like the time clock is staring me in the face that she's on a girls' trip and we are still here. So I appreciate everybody going over with us today. I appreciate so many of you staying on to the very end. I know this is a piece of the puzzle as you navigate, you know, your next steps with funding and sort of figuring out if you were getting a lot of government funding, how things might be shifting for you. Zach, the Cadenza team is so incredibly generous to be giving a free license to that tool for the next week or so, and then the funding search ongoing. So I really highly recommend folks. And if you want a demo or you want to ask more questions about the data privacy and all that kind of stuff, I really encourage you to reach out to him to do so. Any final words, Zach, as we wrap up?
We'll follow up with the recording. I'll email everyone a link to be able to schedule a call. Again, it's 7 days free access to the platform with the code Mallory. You can get $100 off your first month as well. And ongoing, our grant finder tool, like any grant database platform, it's not perfect, but we're, with the help of community and kind of we're leaning in. I think that's going to be where people, if you're not finding a grant, you can submit one that's missing. We'll add it there. It's always a nightmare to figure out who's actively applying. As you can see with our federal grants, you know, it changes by the day and by the hour. So I think those are the things that we're helping kind of build together. But I appreciate for, you know, people like Mallory, Brenda, Cassie, as well as my lovely, beautiful mom, for kind of just sharing their feedback and their advice and their candor of what they've seen work, what they would say are pitfalls that they'd want to avoid. Because I think that's how we continue to build community and continue to avoid just that burnout and that stress that comes with the fundraising process that, Mallory, as you always mentioned so beautifully, that, you know, just as dealing with the uncertainty that comes with our role. So if we could just make one life better, as my mom likes to say, and that life being a grant writers or development directors or an executive director, then that is certainly the life that I'd want to, you know, impact, at least, especially now with everything we're up against. So that's my final word.
Thank you. And Cassie, I think you dropped your link in the chat, right? I'm seeing some questions, maybe if you have space for more clients. So I want to make sure folks know how to get in touch with you as well. And I'm sure that'll be in the follow-up email. Thank you all, Jackie, Brenda, Cassie, Zach, everybody, for being here with us today. See you soon.
See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see everyone.